Marine Corps Junior ROTC, it's time for our next class in our Citizenship and Patriotism series of instruction. This period of instruction specifically will cover our three branches of government. The main goal of this period of instruction is to provide you an understanding and appreciation of the concept of separation of powers within our management and method of government, opposed to a king, a queen in a monarchy, or a dictatorship where one person controls everything. Before we get done with this class, you're going to be responsible for defining the three branches of government, defining what it means to have separations of power. You're going to be responsible during and after this period of instruction of providing examples of what checks and balances are. And most importantly, you're going to be able to identify the roles of the legislative, executive, and judiciary branches of our federal government. Before we get into the class itself, we have to be able to understand some definitions and key words. The first is the executive branch. What is that? It's the part of government that is concerned with carrying out all of the laws at the federal level, not the state level, the federal level. The executive branch consists pretty much of the president, the vice president, and their cabinet. The next key word in definition is the legislative branch, which is the part of government that has the power to make and pass laws, aka Congress, your House of Representatives, and your senators from each state. Your next key word in definition is the judicial branch. The judicial branch is the part of government that's responsible for and concerned with the justice system and the legal system at the federal level. Your last key word in definition is impeachment. Impeachment is when the House of Representatives and Congress attempt to remove the president or an official from office. Now, just because someone was impeached doesn't mean they were removed. Impeachment is the process. The impeached official remains in office until a trial has been held. That trial and their removal from office, if they're convicted of something, is separate from the Impeachment Act itself. Remember, if someone is impeached, that doesn't mean they were removed. That means there was an attempt to remove them. What I'd like to ask is for a student from our class to read this slide and the purpose of why we're here out loud. In order to understand how our three branches of our government were officially established, we've got to tie it back into our freedom documents, the Declaration of Independence, specifically, however, the Constitution of the United States. Our Constitution was influenced by a group of philosophers during the 17th, 18th century in a time known as the Age of Enlightenment, where there were a bunch of intellectual and philosophical movements growing across Europe and began to dominate the world. Those challenges to the monarchy and to the dictatorship type rules that so many European countries had become accustomed to. These French, English, and other European philosophers would meet regularly during these 2 centuries and start to produce printed books, journals, pamphlets, and their ideas began to circulate. They were determined to undermine the authority of the monarchy and the Catholic Church and pave a way for political revolutions during what would be the 18th and 19th centuries. The influence of these European philosophers on our founding fathers is demonstrated time and time again in the writings of Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and others. There were a handful of gentlemen that were responsible for influencing one another and then influencing our founding fathers, as Thomas Jefferson and James Madison spent time in Europe with other influential philosophers. Charles Montesquieu was a French judge and politician. John Locke, one of the very, very popular English political philosophers. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, very, very influential. And then Thomas Hobbes. These are European philosophers that were directly responsible for influencing our forefathers in the framework and the way they wrote our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution. One of the most important concepts that was developed by these philosophers during the Age of Enlightenment was Rousseau's idea that there had to be a written contract between the state, and by state I mean, any form of government, and the people that were being governed. And this contract had to ensure that none of our natural rights, the rights that we were born with, could not be taken away by the state, by any emperor or czar or king or queen or dictator. It was this thinking that led to the acceptance of the Bill of Rights as part of the Constitution that we spoke of in our Freedom Documents class. Another new philosophy was that of Thomas Hobbes' belief that the people should be heard in government by authorizing a representative to speak for them. It was this philosophy that influenced the creation of our representative form of government of democracy, or as we call it, a republic. Now, the major difference between a democracy and a republic is that a republic is a form of government, whereas a democracy is an ideology that helps shape how a government is run. Simply put, a republic is the system of government that allows a country to be a democracy. The development of our Constitution by our founding fathers revolved heavily around their fear of an ultimate power of one person. Their fear of the powers of a monarch led to the development of a central government that operated under a system of checks and balances. Instead of having a monarch, a king, or a queen be responsible to be the judge, jury, and executioner, for lack of a better analogy, our new Constitution established a framework for a government that allowed for three separate branches. We've talking about the executive branch, the legislative, and the judicial. Each of these were designed to check the authority and the power of the other one. The concept of separation of powers is the system of government where several branches are created and ultimate power and control is shared between them. However, the powers of one branch can still be challenged by the other. Each has their own role and responsibility. We'll talk about here later. But even though I'm responsible for my role as a legislative branch, the executive branch, the judicial branch, and that's my job, if I am gooning it up or I'm doing it wrong, then that can be challenged by one or both of the other two. Of the three, let's talk about the legislative branch first. Bottom line up front, the legislative branch makes laws. The legislative branch is made up of the Congress. The Congress is broken down into the Senate, senators, and the House of Representatives, representatives. Those responsible for the framework of the Constitution were concerned about states that had more people in them, the more populous states, and ensuring that they didn't have more power than the states that had less people living there. They were concerned that the population be considered when representatives were elected and selected so that the smaller states didn't have more influence than the larger ones. That led to the checks and balances. Checks and balances were needed between the needs of the state and the needs of its people, and that led to the development of the two-house Congress. So you had tiny little states and very, very large states. If they had a one-house Congress where there were two senators elected from each state, that means that a small state like Rhode Island had two representatives. That wasn't fair because there's no way that a state like Texas could be represented the same if Texas also only had two representatives. Article 1 of the Constitution states that all the legislative powers belong to the Congress of the United States, and that the Congress is made up of both the House of Representatives and the Senate. Because there was a lot of debate about the way forward of the country, we had no idea that we were going to expand westward. We had no concept of large land mass purchases like the Louisiana Purchase and things like that. We didn't know where we were going as a country, but we knew that the colonies couldn't be represented by a singular form of Congress. It had to be broken down into two. Some people believed it and some people didn't. But the establishment of the two-house Congress was called the Great Compromise. And it was a sticking point and a debate that was argued and argued and argued. And it really, honestly, almost stopped the Constitution, or at least Article 1, from being written. So let's break down the Congress into its two houses, the first being the Senate. Well, what makes up the Senate? The Senate is considered the upper chamber of Congress. Not that it's more or less important than one or the other, but it's considered the upper chamber because each senator represents the entire state that they were elected from, opposed to a district like a House of Representatives. But we'll talk about that in a second. Each state, and it doesn't matter how big it is or how populated it is equally represented by two senators. The state of Tennessee has two senators who serve at staggering terms of 6 years so that there's an overlap. That way, not both of them go away at the same time and not two more elected at the same time. So, like I said, every 6 years, there's an election, but there's an overlap where one of them will provide consistency. Now, back in the inception, the Senate was not elected. Actually, they were appointed, which was very similar to the House of Lords in Parliament. Parliament is like the British version of our Congress. And they weren't elected, but they were appointed, or like the House of Commons, you could be appointed to Senate by heredity. That didn't last too long because when people in the Senate are appointed, then you get the good old boy network and people start hooking people up. And of course, you don't want to have a hereditary line of people in the Senate because then people's families, individual bloodlines, start to become part of the conversation and influence policy. So it didn't last very long, but it started out like that. In order to guarantee that senators had the independence and freedom from being influenced by short-term, nearsighted, alligator closest to the boat type political pressures, the constitutional framers decided that a 6-year term was needed and that it be 3 times as long as that of the popularly elected members of the House of Representatives. This represents, a senator represents long-term needs, ideas, laws, and policies of their state. And it provides stability to democratic governing process by having staggered elections, meaning 1/3, 1/3, and 1/3 of these 6-year terms are being replaced or re-elected every 2 years for a total of 6. So that means that I'm serving a 6-year tour as a senator, but a total of 1/3 of the entire total membership of the Senate is elected every 2 years. Again, it provides stability as opposed to the House of Representatives who are thinking short term by design. The second House of Congress is the House of Representatives and is made of, well, representatives. They're the lower chamber of Congress, not because one is more important than the other, but because senators represent the entire state opposed to representatives who only represent a district within their state. Each district is based on population. The number of representatives, I should say, is based on population of a district. Each state is sliced and diced into areas, kind of like combining 3 and 4 counties together. It kind of makes a district. Each district is entitled to at least 1 representative, but depending on the size of that district, they can have and elect more than 1 representative. And these House of Representative officials are directly elected every 2 years. The reason why House reps have a shorter term of 2 years is because they're responsible. for representing the short-term needs, the short-term ideas, the evolution in short-term laws and policies of their state. Look, here's the deal. People's opinions change every day. People want different policies changed and implemented depending on which way the wind's blowing. Our cities, our townships, they evolve and they modernize at the rapid rate. I'll use Mount Juliet as an example. When I graduated Mount Juliet High School in 1993, there were only 5,000 people living in this town. Mount Juliet's not a town anymore. It's a freaking city. There are 36,000 people living in Mount Juliet now. The population has changed. Since 1993, our districts have changed. The evolution of Mount Juliet has different opinions and policies in place, needing to be in place now, opposed to 1993, when we had 3 traffic lights and Golden Bear Gateway didn't exist and Curd Road was a dirt road. The needs of the people evolve and modernize, which is where your House of Representatives come in. They're responsible for the short-term needs. Senators are responsible for the larger picture and long-term needs of the entire state. A House representative will serve the ever-changing will of the people. The reoccurring theme in the establishment of our government through the Constitution, the way it was written, is checks and balances. And the 2-House Congress is a perfect example of checks and balances, especially when it comes to passing laws and legislation. In order for a bill to become a law, both the House of Representatives and Congress have to agree to it. Now, this can sometimes be long and arduous process. This just usually means that the original version of that bill has been altered in a joint committee to meet the standards of both the House and the Congress. They will debate it and debate it and debate it. They will rewrite it, and they will find that happy medium between senators' belief in what's best for the entire state long term and the House representatives' needs of ensuring that their constituents in their local districts are taken care of as well. After that bill's been rewritten 1,000 times and they've come to an agreement, the bill is then sent to the President of the United States for his or her signature in order to become law. If the President doesn't sign the bill within 10 days, then it automatically becomes law without his signature. The President may also refuse to sign that law, and then it gets sent back to Congress for additional changes. This act is called a veto. When I was a kid watching Saturday morning cartoons, there were always lessons learned at the beginning and the end of the cartoons, and there were little clips, commercials, and videos in between cartoons so that instead of just staring at the tube drooling, we were able to learn something. One of those things that I remember from a kid is a Schoolhouse Rock. One of the Schoolhouse Rock videos, the sing-alongs, was I'm Just a Bill. I've got this link in your pre-work in the learning management system. So I hope you took a look at it, and I hope you got a kick out of it. Beyond their responsibility of passing laws, the legislative branch is responsible for developing and making our money and our system of it. They're responsible for our post offices and how they're managed. They're responsible for admitting new states and voting on whether or not they're going to be joining our union. They're responsible for helping fund and raise support and develop the roles and responsibilities of those managing our military. They're responsible for establishing our taxing system, our court system. They're responsible for regulating trade, meaning what we sell and export to other countries, what we buy and import from other countries. And they're responsible for declaring war. Now, there is an exception to that policy where the Marine Corps is authorized to be used by the president as at his or her discretion for up to 90 days without the permission of the legislative branch. They're also responsible for borrowing money from other countries if we need it. Now that we've discussed the legislative branch, Let's move on to the second branch of government, the executive branch. Bottom line up front, the executive branch carries out the laws developed and implemented by the legislative branch. Don't forget, the president has a piece of the puzzle. It overlaps with the legislative branch. However, the executive branch is made up of the president, the vice president, and their cabinet. Now, the cabinet is an appointed position, not an elected position. There are 15 executive departments. Some of them, for example, are the secretaries of agriculture, the secretary of commerce, the secretary of defense, the secretary of education, the secretary of energy, the secretary of health and human services, the secretary of homeland security, housing and urban development, and interior, labor, blah, 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 blah. Because the presidential cabinet within the executive branch is appointed and not elected, they don't always serve the full 4-year term accompanying the president and vice president. There are all kinds of circumstances in which a cabinet member would resign or move on or maybe just retire or be replaced by the president. But the president and the vice president are elected to a 4-year term, and they hold the executive power within the United States, and they're responsible for executing the laws and developing relationships with foreign countries. But like we mentioned, both the legislative and judiciary branches have the authority to check the presidential executive power, meaning if the president makes a decision, the legislative branch, let's say the president vetoed a bill, they could go back and re-vote and get a majority rule, and the veto would be thrown out. Another example would be if the president was to make a decision that maybe was questionable, the judiciary branch would determine whether or not that decision was constitutional. Like we mentioned before, it takes an act of Congress, aka the legislative branch, to declare war. Now, although the president is not able to declare war, they are allowed to use U.S. troops in certain situations like national emergencies or when American interests are threatened. For example, President Eisenhower employed the National Guard to ensure Arkansas schools were desegregated in 1957. The National Guard gets used quite often. President Reagan in 1983 sent Marines to Grenada and Lebanon to protect U.S. lives and property when there were a bunch of shenanigans going on down there. President Bush Bush Sr., I should say, sent troops to the Persian Gulf to liberate Kuwait in the Gulf War. Now, we call this the first Gulf War, but the irony is there was no formal declaration of war. But Congress did support the troops being sent to liberate Kuwait. There are plenty of examples in modern times where the president has used troops, and we talk about the Marine Corps specifically being able to be used for 30 days without congressional approval. Although the president has many responsibilities, the president has the responsibility for entering into treaties with foreign countries if necessary. If we want to end a conflict and sign a treaty with a country that we had been at war with, or if we wanted to enter into some type of treaty, economic or otherwise, with a country that maybe didn't have our best interests at heart for the longest time, then it's the responsibility of the president to get the wheels moving and to make liaison and to start the treaty process. But he can't have the treaty approved and signed without the consent of Congress. Some of the other responsibilities that the president has is to make appointments for the Supreme Court and for federal judges. We already talked about the president's responsible for making their own cabinet posts and assigning ambassadors to the embassies across the globe. So we have an embassy in the majority of countries around the globe where it is a Marine security guard detail, and there are ambassadors there that speak on our behalf to their local governments, their country's governments. But in order for us to allow the president to make any of these appointments, it has to be approved. Each one of these appointments has to be approved with a 2/3 approval by Senate. Whenever we hear on the news during presidential elections or local elections, we always hear of these promises, these things that I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, I'm going to do this, I'm going to change the law. The reality is, no president of the United States has ever had the authority to make law on their own. Although they don't make the law, they do have a ton of advisors, all right, and they are always in contact with the legislative branch, the senators and the congressmen, and they have their messages to Congress as well. So they'll get up on the pulpit and speak to Congress and try to persuade them that this is the way we need to go forward on economics or whatever the law is. He can request that legislation, meaning laws and bills, be passed. One of the most important checks and balances, we've been talking about checks and balances the whole time during this class, that the legislative branch, the judicial branch, and the executive branch can check each other so that one doesn't have ultimate power. One of the biggest checks and balances on the executive branch by the other two is the ability for the other two branches of service to remove the president from office. This is what is one of the key distinct differences between definitely a dictatorship, but I would say a monarchy as well. The House of Representatives, that is the lower house in Congress, has the authority to vote for impeachment. If the request for removal receives enough votes, then the Senate will conduct a trial with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court presiding over the trial. And with a 2/3 majority vote of all members present, then the president can be dismissed from the office. Now, here's what I want you to understand. It is a dismissal from office. A president is not impeached when he goes away. Impeachment is the process, not the removal. And we get this confused all the time. We think when a president gets booted out of office that he was impeached, that she was impeached. That's not the case. There have been a handful of presidents that have been impeached but did not get, quote unquote, removed from office. Just want to clarify that definition. Impeachment is the process of removal, not the actual removal. As of this recording in January 2021, to date, no sitting president has ever been removed through the impeachment process. However, there were some that were acquitted, meaning they were found not guilty, and some of them resigned. Andrew Johnson in 1868 was impeached but acquitted. Richard Nixon was impeached in 1972 and resigned. President Bill Clinton was impeached in 1998 and was acquitted. And then here recently, President Donald Trump was impeached and acquitted. We talked a little bit about the responsibilities of the executive branch. Let's talk about some of the roles of the executive branch. Some of the things that they're responsible are to signing bills into laws, ordering military troops into situations, appointing federal judges, making treaties, recognizing or refusing to recognize foreign governments, convening special sessions of Congress, developing the federal budget, and granting pardons to those convicted of breaking federal law. This is nowhere near an all-encompassing list, but these are some things that you might see in the future and are testable. Bing, bang, boom, got the legislative branch knocked out. Wham, bam, got the executive branch knocked out. Hee-hoo, here we are to talk about the third branch of government, the judicial branch. Bottom line up front, the judicial branch is responsible for interpreting laws, constitutional law, not drilled all the way down to which way to turn left on Mount Juliet Road and who got pulled over for speeding. That's not what we're talking about. The judicial branch is made up of the Supreme Court, and then there are other lower federal court systems interpreting congressional law, not making law. we vote for those to be assigned to the executive branch. We vote for the president and the vice president. We vote for the legislative branch members. Meaning we vote for the congressmen, the senators, the House of Representatives, if you will. But members of the judicial branch are appointed by the president. But when the president says, "Hey, this is who I think our judges need to be," the only way that's going to happen is if the Senate confirms it with a 2/3 majority vote. The Supreme Court of the United States is the highest court in our country, and it's the only federal judiciary system specifically required by the way the Constitution was written. A lot of times when you're ear hustling with your parents while they're watching the news, you may hear senators and House of Representative members, or even the President of the United States saying, "Hey, whatever this disagreement is, we're going to take it to the Supreme Court." Okay, here's the deal. The Supreme Court can hear an appeal on any question of the law, providing that it has jurisdiction. But it's really going to be a rare occasion where the Supreme Court holds a trial. The Supreme Court can hear an appeal, meaning there is a law trying to be passed at a lower level, or a law being decided on at a lower federal court. If it can't be, or if they want it to be appealed, meaning I don't agree with this lower court's decision, I'm going to appeal this lower federal court, and I want this case taken to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, only on a very, very rare occasion, are actually going to hold a trial. What they're going to do instead is they're going to interpret the meaning of that particular law. They're going to open up the Constitution. They are stewards of these documents, and they're going to interpret the actual meaning of that law. And then they're going to decide whether that law is relevant to our particular set of facts. They're also going to determine if that law is passed, how it should be applied. In addition to the Supreme Court, you've got lower federal courts and you've got state courts. These lower federal and state courts, when those judges make those decisions at that state or lower federal level, they have to be online with the rules and regulations, the constitutional interpretation, and the decisions already made by the Supreme Court. The state judges or the lower federal judges can't make a decision on a case for or against something if it conflicts with a decision already established by the Supreme Court. Criminal proceedings, meaning we're going to punish someone for robbing a bank or something like that, they can be conducted at the state or the federal law. And it depends on the nature and the extent of a crime. If someone locally here robs Walmart down the road, that's not something that's going to be run up all the way to a federal court system. That's going to be conducted down at the state level. Civil cases, however, deal with disputes between individuals or organizations, meaning, what things that we call white collar crime. So if someone is being tried for embezzling money or insider trading in the stock market or things like that, those are civil cases. Or if I have a disagreement between my landlord because of my rent or something like that, these are not criminal cases. These are civil cases, and they are, depending on the severity, and usually a lot of it depends on whether there was a lot of money involved or whether there was a government entity involved. That will be determined. Those things would be determined whether or not they are held at the state or lower federal court. There's no way that the Supreme Court would be able to handle everything on their own. That's why we have these lower federal courts that we've been talking about, the United States District Courts and the United States Courts of Appeals, meaning I want to appeal a decision by another court that was already made, and I want to have it overturned or changed. Take a look at this map real quick, and you can see where the districts play out and are geographically located within the United States. The way the Constitution is written, it provides judicial power of the United States to be managed through the Supreme Court and through as many federal courts as Congress decides necessary. If for whatever reason the United States of America continue to acquire states or to gain more territory and get larger or maybe smaller, then the districts those lower federal courts would be, their boundaries and responsibilities would be reshuffled. Now, prior to 1803, the Supreme Court was only responsible for interpreting the constitutional law. But in 1803, Chief Justice Marshall ruled that the Supreme Court could actually declare a law that we are following as unconstitutional, which means that law would go away if it didn't marry up with the verbiage and interpretation of the Constitution. When that decision was made early in our existence, it established the power of the Supreme Court to have judicial review, meaning that this check of power of on both Congress and the president became the most important of the judicial branch's responsibility within the government. The judicial branch at that point said, hey, all of these laws that you're wanting to pass in Congress, all of the laws that the president are wanting to pass, they have to now or should go through us if it needs judicial review. And we will be the ones to determine, we being the Supreme Court, will be the ones to determine whether this law that you want to pass, whether you vote on it to pass and it gets approved or not, it will come under our review. We will tell you whether this law that you want to pass is a constitutional law. Although the members of Congress and the President of the United States take an oath to uphold the Constitution, it's the judiciary branch that decides whether their actions are constitutional or not. Like we mentioned in our Freedom Documents class, the Constitution is the law of the land. And as an interpreter of that law, the federal judges in our Supreme Courts have a great deal of power. But let's not forget that the legislative and executive branch have the opportunity to check or change or trump that power. An example would be an amendment to the Constitution. If our country got together and our representatives voted and it was approved to amend the Constitution, then the federal judges would be responsible for upholding and interpreting that new amendment of the Constitution. A lot of responsibility, but a good system that we have for checks and balances. Although not an all-encompassing list, here's some very quick examples of the responsibilities and roles of the judiciary branch. Number one, they're responsible for declaring laws constitutional or unconstitutional. They're responsible for resolving conflicts between the states or between a state and the federal government. And they also serve as the final decision maker in cases involving federal law. As of this recording in January 2021, this was the most current photo of the Supreme Court of the United States. However, it's not up to date. Last fall in 2020, Chief Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away. She's the older woman with the glasses on the bottom row. When she passed away, Justice Stephen Breyer became the Chief Justice, and then the appointment of Amy Coney Barrett took place on October 27th to the 7th District Court of Appeals. Our system of three branches of government established by our Constitution is the reason why our country has lasted so long. It is why we thrive and are more economic and socially productive opposed to a dictatorship or a monarchy. This system of checks and balances is one of the reasons why our form of democracy continues more than 200 years after the framers of the Constitution met in Philadelphia to develop it. Our Constitution was the first of its kind, and it is the most enduring, meaning it's lasted the longest. Our Constitution is the framework for constitutions used by other countries across the world. They don't always model it exactly after ours, and it's why a lot of them have failed. It's January 2021 as I'm recording this for you guys. We've had a weird and crazy year. 2020 was off the charts. But what I want you to understand is our country has survived a lot worse. Believe it or not, we think that 2020 is the end of times. It's not. Our country has survived many, many wars, economic depressions, recessions, natural disasters. we have thrived and we will continue to thrive because our form of government is the most effective form of government on planet Earth. We have three branches of government: the legislative, the executive, and judicial. And these are responsible to one another for keeping the other branch in check. If not for our Constitution and the way it was written, if not for our court systems and our elected representatives voting on laws based on the way our Constitution was written, then our country would have fallen a long time ago. We're not perfect. We're never going to be perfect. And we knew that when the Constitution was written. But by our design, the Constitution was written to allow for change based on the needs of our nation at that time. And I promise you, regardless of what went on in 2020, our nation will get through, we will thrive, we will be successful, and we will be better for it on the backside based on the way our branches of government keep each other in check. I hope you learned something during this period of instruction. I hope that you're going to be able to take this period of instruction and apply it to our political systems of government and our economic systems of government classes coming up. And most importantly, when you become a young voting adult, that you are intellectually sound on all things Constitution, three branches of government, and how your vote counts. Super Fidelis, hoorah, and as always, yut yut!